The coke hit her before anyone bothered to ask her name. Dressed in smoke-stained clothes after hours of charity work, the black woman stood dripping while the staff laughed, certain they had humiliated someone too poor to fight back. Funny how cruelty suddenly calls itself a misunderstanding when money walks through the door. Because moments later a billionaire entered, saw two guards holding his wife, and the entire room forgot how to breathe. But the missing charity meals and the trap behind that filthy stunt were far bigger than one arrogant employee. Where are you watching from? Stay until the end, because this reckoning will not disappoint you. Friday afternoon rain streaked the windows of the Gilded Oak, an expensive restaurant and cafe in the city's financial district, where polished shoes crossed marble floors and investment deals were discussed over porcelain cups. Only hours earlier, a fire had destroyed a low-income apartment complex and left more than 80 families homeless. Imani Ellison had spent the morning at the emergency shelter, hauling water-sorting donations and helping a terrified mother carry two children away from the smoke. She had given her clean coat to a pregnant woman, leaving herself in a soot-stained sweater, muddy jeans, and a sleeve torn at the elbow. A canvas bag hung from her shoulder filled with family intake forms and donated clothes. She came to the Gilded Oak to collect 300 hot meals the restaurant had already been paid to provide to Open Hands Relief Network. The moment Imani entered, Caleb Mercer looked her over with open disgust and blocked her path. "You need to leave," he said. He did not ask her name or examine the phone she raised. When Imani calmly explained that she was collecting a confirmed charity order, Caleb smirked and told her the restaurant did not hand out leftovers to homeless people. Several customers turned to watch. One man quietly raised his phone. Imani opened the confirmation email, but Caleb knocked her hand aside. "People like you always invent excuses to enter places that are not for you," he said. A few guests laughed under their breath. Marianne Voss, the restaurant manager, approached wearing the controlled smile of someone who believed politeness could hide contempt. She did not correct Caleb or inspect the email. Instead, she claimed no order existed and accused Imani of frightening the guests. Imani kept her voice steady. "Open the delivery records. 300 families are waiting for meals that have already been paid for." Caleb glanced at the people watching him. He had expected her to apologize, beg, or leave. Her calmness made him feel challenged. He grabbed a large cup of Coke from the service counter and stepped closer. "Maybe this will help you understand that you are not welcome here." Then he tipped the cup. Dark soda poured over Imani's hair, streamed down her face and soaked into her smoke-stained sweater. Ice scattered across the floor. The restaurant fell silent. Caleb kept smiling. Marianne simply motioned to two security guards and ordered them to remove Imani for causing a disturbance. Imani did not strike him or shout. She wiped Coke from her eyes, looked directly at Caleb, and asked, "How many times have you done this to people who had no one powerful enough to protect them?" His smile faltered. Marianne immediately demanded Imani's phone, claiming she had recorded staff illegally. When Imani refused, the guards seized both her arms. At that moment, the front doors opened. Roman Ellison entered with Isaiah Grant and two aides, expecting to meet his wife and discuss an emergency fund for the displaced families. He stopped when he saw soda dripping from Imani's hair and two guards gripping her. Roman did not shout. His voice was quiet enough to freeze the room. "Take your hands off her." Marianne recognized the billionaire and went pale. Caleb stammered that the woman was homeless, aggressive, and causing trouble. Roman looked at the overturned cup, then at Imani. "The woman you just poured Coke on is my wife," he said. "But that is not why you are going to answer for what you did." His arrival frightened everyone who had been smiling moments earlier, but Imani was already looking beyond the humiliation. 300 meals were still missing, and someone inside the Gilded Oak had been willing to degrade her publicly to stop her from finding them. Marianne Voss changed the moment she recognized Roman Ellison. The cold authority in her voice disappeared, replaced by a polished smile that looked almost painful. She called Imani Mrs. Ellison offered her clean tableau. "You suggested opening a private dining room so she could change clothes away from the staring customers." Caleb Mercer stood beside the service counter, pale and suddenly uncertain, repeating that the entire incident had been a misunderstanding. He claimed Imani had behaved aggressively, that she had frightened the guests, and that he had only reacted badly under pressure. Roman ordered Marianne to suspend him immediately, but Imani raised one wet hand and stopped her husband. She would not allow everyone in the room to pretend the problem had been solved simply because a powerful man had arrived. Imani refused the private room, the complimentary wine, and Marianne's hurried offer to reimburse her damaged clothes. Coke was still dripping from her hair when she asked to see the restaurant's delivery ledger, kitchen production records, invoices, and loading schedules for the 300 meals promised to open hands. Marianne said the order had been cancelled that morning. Imani unlocked her phone and displayed an email sent less than 2 hours earlier, confirming that the meals would be ready by 4:30. The message carried Marianne's digital signature. For the first time, the manager had no immediate answer. Imani then requested that every camera recording from the dining room entrance, kitchen corridor, and loading dock be preserved. Marianne looked toward the office and announced that the surveillance system had suffered an unexpected technical failure. The local police arrived minutes later, but instead of separating Caleb from the witnesses, one officer approached Imani first. He looked at her stained clothes and asked why she had refused to leave private property after being told to go. Roman's expression hardened, but Imani answered before he could intervene. She explained that she had not broken into the building or demanded free food. She represented an organization that had already paid for hundreds of meals intended for families who had lost their homes that morning. Another officer asked whether she had raised her voice. Imani looked at the puddle of coke beneath her feet and calmly replied, "Would my volume make what he did more legal?" A lawyer representing the Gilded Oak soon appeared and requested a private conversation. He offered the Ellisons a substantial confidential settlement if they agreed not to contact the media release video or make public allegations against the restaurant. Roman immediately said no, but Imani asked the lawyer to place every term in writing. The request changed the atmosphere. Marianne's face tightened because a written offer could later suggest that the restaurant was attempting to purchase silence before the facts had been investigated. At that moment, Caleb suddenly clutched his wrist and claimed Imani had scratched him while threatening to attack. He displayed a thin red mark and declared that he was the true victim. Marianne supported his account without hesitation, telling the officers that she had witnessed Imani move toward him in an intimidating manner. Across the room, Jade Morales remained near the reception desk, pretending to organize menus. When Marianne entered the management office with the lawyer, Jade quietly passed Isaiah Grant a folded receipt. Written on the back were a file location, a password, and a timestamp. Isaiah accessed the management computer before anyone could shut it down. Inside the folder was a photograph of Imani taken from the Open Hands website, a copy of her schedule for the day, and a note attached to her expected arrival time. She will come directly from the relief site wearing work clothes. Do not let her reach the delivery records. Isaiah showed the file to Imani and Roman. The message proved Marianne had known exactly who Imani was before she entered the restaurant. The humiliation had not been a spontaneous act caused by mistaken identity. Someone had expected her, studied her movements, and prepared to provoke or remove her before she could examine the missing meal records. Before Marianne could explain, a technician emerged from the surveillance room with another disturbing discovery. The cameras had not failed for the entire afternoon. Only 13 minutes had been erased, beginning 2 minutes before Imani walked through the door and ending seconds after Caleb poured the coke. A technical malfunction could not choose such perfect timing. Imani now understood that she had not entered a restaurant with one cruel employee. She had walked directly into a trap built specifically for her. The 16-second video began spreading before Imani had even finished giving her statement. It started after the coke had already been poured, carefully removing Caleb's insult, his smile, and the moment the cup tilted over her head. All viewers saw was Imani stepping toward him, soda dripping from her hair, asking how many helpless people he had treated that way. Her voice had been artificially amplified while Caleb's response was cut away. The caption appeared beneath thousands of shares: "Billionaire's wife threatens restaurant employee after she is denied special treatment." By the time Imani arrived at the police station, strangers were calling her entitled, unstable, and dangerous. Caleb appeared outside the Gilded Oak with his wrist wrapped in a white bandage large enough to suggest a serious injury. He told reporters that Imani had stormed into the restaurant, demanded free food, screamed at employees, and tried to attack him when he asked her to leave. Marianne stood beside him and declared that the Gilded Oak welcomed every community but would not allow financial power to intimidate ordinary workers. It was a polished lie dressed in the language of fairness. Although Imani was the person who had been publicly humiliated, the police asked her to come in and answer an assault allegation. Roman's attorneys could have challenged the request immediately, but Imani chose to cooperate. She knew refusing would allow the restaurant to claim she was hiding behind wealth. At the station, she was placed in an interview room, while Caleb was questioned briefly and allowed to leave. An officer repeatedly asked whether she had lost control when the restaurant refused to serve her. Imani corrected him each time. The restaurant had not refused her personal service. It had withheld 300 prepaid meals meant for displaced families. Another officer asked whether she had moved aggressively toward Caleb. "I moved one step," she replied. "He poured a drink over my head in a crowded room. Why is my step being examined more closely than his hand?" Roman waited outside the room, his anger sharpening with every passing minute. Imani asked him not to call senior officials or pressure the department. She wanted the entire process documented exactly as it occurred. While he waited, Ellison Meridian's board contacted him. They warned that the growing scandal could delay a multi-billion-dollar acquisition and damage investor confidence. Their proposed solution was simple. Roman should release a statement saying his wife had been under severe emotional pressure after working at the fire site. It sounded sympathetic, but the meaning was poisonous. They wanted to describe Imani as exhausted, irrational, and possibly unstable, without directly calling her any of those things. Roman ended the call without agreeing. Across the city, Isaiah Grant traced the video's first upload to Kyle Benton, a crisis communications consultant hired by Sebastian Rourke, before Imani entered the restaurant. The original file metadata showed that its caption, thumbnail, and description had been prepared before the police arrived. In the unedited footage, Caleb looked directly toward Kyle's phone before reaching for the Coke. He paused until the camera angle was clear, then lifted the cup. He had known he was being filmed. The attack had been designed to produce a reaction that could later be stripped of context and sold to the public as proof of Imani's aggression. Then Jade contacted Imani. Her message was brief. "I heard them say they had to make you angry before you saw the delivery ledger." She arranged to meet Isaiah in a parking garage near her apartment, but she never arrived. Her phone went dark. When Isaiah entered her apartment with the building manager, he found drawers, emptied furniture overturned, and her laptop missing. Her medicine identification and travel bag were still there. Jade had not planned to leave. Minutes before her phone lost its signal, however, she had managed to send one audio file. It lasted only 7 seconds. Marianne's voice could be heard clearly. "Quentin gave us her schedule. Do not let Imani touch those invoices." Quentin Shaw was not an employee of the Gilded Oak. He was the financial director of Open Hands. The man who had worked beside Imani for 7 years, knew every movement in her schedule, and had access to every dollar intended for the families she served. The enemy was no longer standing behind a restaurant counter. He had been sitting inside her own office all along. Imani returned to Open Hands before sunrise, still wearing the sweater stained with smoke and dried coke. In the open-airy shelter, families displaced by the apartment fire were dividing a few trays of sandwiches into portions too small to satisfy anyone. Children watched the food disappear while volunteers apologized for the 300 hot meals that had never arrived. Imani said nothing about the humiliation at the Gilded Oak. She walked into the financial office with an independent accountant and began examining every payment made during the previous 8 months. The numbers exposed something far larger than a missing dinner order. The Gilded Oak had billed Open Hands for thousands of meals, many of which had no delivery confirmations. 11 other companies had received money for medicine, clothing, transportation, emergency housing, and sanitation supplies. Several invoices were duplicated, while others charged 4 times the normal market price. By noon, the amount connected to suspicious transactions had passed $4.8 million. Quentin Shaw arrived carrying coffee and concern, playing the role he had perfected during 7 years beside Imani. He called the discrepancies a synchronization error and urged her to let the legal department handle everything. Then, he suggested she temporarily step away from leadership because the restaurant incident had created an appearance of personal retaliation. When Imani refused, Quentin summoned an emergency meeting of the Open Hands board and calmly implied that she was using a respected charity to punish a business after an embarrassing personal dispute. Inside the conference room, Quentin presented dozens of contracts bearing Imani's electronic signature. According to the records, she had approved inflated meal prices, removed delivery verification requirements, and authorized payments to vendors without competitive review. Several board members began exchanging worried looks. Quentin recommended suspending Imani until a complete audit could be finished. If the motion passed, He would gain control of the organization's accounts, servers, and remaining evidence. Imani did not accuse him immediately. She placed one invoice on the table and asked why it had been signed on a morning when she was speaking at a humanitarian conference in South Africa. Quentin replied that remote signatures were common. Imani placed 3 more invoices beside it. All 4 had been approved at the exact same second, from a computer located inside Quentin's private office. The independent accountant then displayed a forensic report showing that Imani's signature had been copied from an old grant application and attached to hundreds of transactions through Quentin's administrator credentials. He had not simply stolen money. He had spent years constructing a paper trail designed to make Imani appear responsible when the fraud was finally discovered. Quentin's expression changed only slightly, but his hand tightened around his pen. He announced that he would not answer further questions without an attorney, and left the room before security could take his company laptop. While Isaiah moved to lock Quentin out of the system, investigative reporter Maya Chen uncovered another connection. All 11 suspicious vendors had been registered through the same law office. Their profits flowed into a hidden parent company managed by a former financial officer for Sebastian Rourke, owner of the Gilded Oak. The missing meals, medical supplies, and emergency housing payments were parts of one coordinated network. Imani ordered an immediate freeze on every vendor payment. 10 minutes later, every Open Hands computer went black. Staff members lost access to financial records, family files, donor accounts, and shelter assignments. A message appeared across the main screen: "Restore the payments before midnight or every record will disappear with the building." Before anyone could react, the fire alarm erupted from the basement archive. Smoke began curling beneath the stairwell door as volunteers shouted that people were still downstairs. Imani looked toward the locked server room and understood that the conspirators were no longer trying to hide their crimes with forged paperwork. They were preparing to burn the evidence and anyone unfortunate enough to remain beside it. The fire spread through the basement archive faster than anyone expected. Flames climbed the shelves, holding paper contracts, delivery receipts, donor files, and years of financial records. Thick smoke rolled beneath the stairwell door, while volunteers rushed frightened families toward the exits. Roman ordered everyone away from the building, but a head count revealed that Malik Carter, a 17-year-old volunteer, was missing. One of the shelter mothers remembered seeing him run downstairs to retrieve a box of medication for his younger sister. The fire door had automatically locked behind him. Imani moved toward the stairwell before Roman could stop her. He caught her arm and told her the firefighters were coming, but she pulled free. "I will not leave a child inside to protect records or my reputation," she said. Isaiah grabbed an emergency mask and followed her into the smoke. The basement was almost impossible to see. Imani called Malik's name while Isaiah forced open the warped fire door with a metal bar. They found the teenager crouched beside a storage cabinet, coughing and clutching the medicine box against his chest. A burning beam crashed behind them as Isaiah lifted Malik and guided him toward the stairs. They reached the ground floor seconds before part of the basement ceiling collapsed. Roman pulled Imani outside, furious and relieved at the same time. Firefighters entered moments later and discovered something more disturbing than faulty wiring. The flames had started in 3 separate locations. The main sprinkler valve had been closed manually, and the security panel showed signs of deliberate tampering. This had not been an accident. Someone had wanted the archive destroyed before the stolen money could be traced. Quentin Shaw appeared at the scene less than 15 minutes later, even though no one from Open Hands had contacted him. He claimed he had received an automatic emergency alert, but Isaiah checked the access logs and found that Quentin's account had been disconnected an hour before the alarm. He should not have known the fire had started. Before investigators could question him properly, media outlets friendly to Sebastian Rourke began publishing the same story. Open Hands had failed to maintain its building, endangered teenage volunteers, and lost control of sensitive donor records. City inspectors arrived before sunrise and suspended the shelter's residential permit, citing fire safety violations. More than 80 displaced families now faced removal from the only temporary home available to them. Sebastian appeared on television wearing a solemn expression and offered humanitarian assistance to the families on the condition that Imani resign and allow an outside administrator to take control of Open Hands. Evelyn Price refused to accept the public narrative. Jade had mentioned that every delivery driver was required to confirm arrivals through an independent GPS application. Evelyn contacted the software company and obtained the location history before anyone could erase it. The data proved that trucks carrying food purchased by Open Hands had never reached the shelter. Instead, they had traveled to a warehouse outside the city. From there, the food was redirected to luxury weddings, corporate conferences, private clubs, and political fundraisers. Meals, paid for with charity donations, had been sold a second time to wealthy customers. Families at Open Hands had gone hungry while businesses collected money twice for the same food. The ownership records of the warehouse revealed an even more dangerous connection. The property belonged to a logistics company in which Ellison Meridian's investment division had purchased a major stake 2 years earlier. Roman had not personally approved the deal, but his corporation had earned profits from the transportation network used to move the stolen food. His board immediately demanded silence. Their attorneys warned that public disclosure could expose the company to lawsuits, criminal investigation, and billions in losses. One director told Roman that he had to choose between protecting his wife and protecting the empire he had built. Roman refused to accept that choice. He opened the original acquisition file and traced the final authorization. The signature did not belong to a minor investment manager. It belonged to Ellison Meridian's vice chairman, the same man the board had just nominated to replace Roman if the scandal forced him out. The conflict had moved far beyond Imani and one corrupt restaurant. It had entered Roman's own corporation, where powerful men were preparing to use the crisis to seize control, sacrifice him, and bury the truth beneath the ruins of Open Hands. Roman summoned an emergency meeting at Ellison Meridian and demanded an independent audit of every investment connected to the warehouse, the Gilded Oak, and the missing relief supplies. The board reacted as though transparency itself were the threat. Directors warned that opening the records could destroy the company's share price, trigger lawsuits, and delay contracts worth billions. Their preferred solution was colder and simpler. Roman should publicly distance himself from Imani, describe Open Hands as an organization she controlled alone, and allow her to take responsibility for the fraudulent contracts. Roman refused. He reminded them that his company had profited from the transportation network used to steal charity food, whether he had personally approved it or not. Minutes later, the board voted to suspend his executive authority for an alleged conflict of interest. The man appointed to replace him was the vice chairman, whose signature appeared on the warehouse investment. Roman left the conference room stripped of operational control but carrying copies of every document the board had tried to keep sealed. Across the city, Imani stood outside the damaged Open Hands building, preparing to address reporters. City inspectors were waiting to close the shelter, and more than 80 displaced families needed somewhere safe to sleep before nightfall. Imani intended to explain the relocation plan, but before she could reach the microphone, financial crimes officers arrived with a search warrant. They entered her office, opened the private safe, and began removing evidence in full view of the cameras. Inside, they claimed to find $1 million in cash, a passport bearing Imani's photograph under another name, a contract transferring ownership of the Open Hands property, and a device containing stolen copies of her electronic signature. They also produced records showing charity money transferred into an offshore account registered to her. Every item had been arranged to tell the same story. Imani had created the fraudulent network stolen from homeless families and staged the restaurant scandal to distract the public when the scheme began collapsing. The officers placed Imani in handcuffs before the families she had spent the week protecting. A little girl stepped forward and asked why they were arresting the woman who had carried her mother out of the burning building. No one answered. Quentin Shaw appeared beside the press line wearing an expression of rehearsed sorrow. He told reporters that he had warned the Open Hands board about Imani's increasingly irregular behavior, presenting himself as a brave employee who had finally chosen integrity over loyalty. Sebastian Rourke released a statement moments later suggesting that the Coke incident might have been a deliberate performance designed to make Imani look like a victim before her financial crimes were exposed. The lie spread quickly because it offered the public an easier story than a coordinated conspiracy. The wealthy charity director had stolen money, manipulated sympathy, and blamed an ordinary restaurant worker. Isaiah reviewed external security footage while the search continued. A service van had entered Open Hands during the confusion surrounding the basement fire. The driver used an access card issued through Quentin's administrator account and carried several heavy containers into the building before leaving through a loading entrance. The footage supported Imani's claim that the evidence had been planted, but it did not identify the driver clearly enough to stop the arrest. Roman arrived as officers escorted his wife toward the police vehicle. He had enough influence to make calls, delay procedures, and turn the scene into a confrontation, but he refused to hand their enemies another image they could edit. He faced Imani and promised, "I will bring you home with evidence, not with a private favor." Imani held his gaze and replied, "Do not only prove that I am innocent, prove that this system was built to find someone who looks like me and make her carry everyone else's guilt." Before the officers placed her inside the vehicle, a volunteer pushed through the crowd and slipped a folded note into Imani's hand. Jade had sent it through an intermediary. "They do not need the charity money anymore. They need the property empty before Monday's vote." From behind the window of the police car, Imani watched city workers attach a temporary seizure notice to the entrance of Open Hands. Printed in the corner was the name of a development proposal already seeking permission to use that exact land, Pembroke River District. Imani had believed the restaurant attack was designed to hide stolen meals and fraudulent invoices. Now she understood that the food and money had only financed the opening move. Their real objective was to destroy Open Hands, discredit its founder, and seize land worth hundreds of millions of dollars, before anyone realized the entire scandal had been engineered for a property deal. Imani was released on bail after a forensic accountant proved that the offshore account had been opened with forged identification, but the court still sustained. Roman temporarily stepped down as CEO of Ellison Meridian so no one could claim he was controlling the audit from inside the company. He authorized the release of every investment record connected to the warehouse, even though doing so could expose him and the corporation to civil liability. While lawyers fought over the evidence planted in Imani's office, she joined Maya Chen in examining city planning files. The pattern became visible almost immediately. Open Hands occupied the center of a proposed luxury development containing hotels, high-rise apartments, private offices, and an expensive retail complex. Every surrounding property had already been purchased by companies connected to Sebastian Rourke's investment network. The Relief Center was the only building, preventing the entire project from moving forward. Years earlier, the city had offered Imani a fraction of the property's true value, but she had refused because hundreds of struggling families depended on the shelter, food bank, clinic, and legal services operating there. The land had never been worthless. It had only been occupied by people the developers believed could be removed without consequence. The missing meals and stolen donations were not the final objective. They were tools in a carefully staged seizure. Harlan Pembroke, the deputy mayor responsible for urban redevelopment, had helped build the plan step by step. Charity money was redirected into shell companies to weaken Open Hands financially. Imani's signature was forged so the crimes could eventually be placed on her. The confrontation at the Gilded Oak was arranged to destroy her reputation and create the image of an unstable woman abusing her wealth. The fire erased records while also giving the city grounds to suspend the shelter's operating permit. The planted evidence justified her arrest, only days before the council vote that could transfer control of the property. Once Open Hands appeared corrupt, unsafe, and leaderless, the city could seize the land cheaply and hand it to Sebastian's Development Alliance. The trap was designed so that every response would benefit them. If Roman used his fortune to purchase the land, they would accuse the Ellisons of manipulating public property for private gain. If he remained silent, the shelter would close and the developers would win. Isaiah finally located Jade in a witness safe house operated by a non-profit legal organization. She had disappeared after two men broke into her apartment, threatened her mother, and warned that anyone who spoke about the Gilded Oak would regret it. Jade had escaped with one old phone that had once been connected to the restaurant's internal communications system. Stored on it were fragments of conversations between Marianne Sebastian Quentin and a man identified only as HP. In one recording, Sebastian said, "Once Imani loses control on camera, the council will have no reason to protect her center." A second voice answered, "The property must be empty by Monday." Maya compared the voice with public speeches and identified it as Harlan Pembroke. Pembroke immediately held a press conference denying any involvement. He accused Roman of manufacturing digital evidence to save his wife and claimed the redevelopment project would bring jobs to a neglected neighborhood. At the same time, city attorneys filed an emergency motion demanding that Jade's phone data be destroyed because it had allegedly been obtained without authorization. The request itself revealed how frightened they were of what the device contained. Then Jade disclosed the detail that changed everything. Her phone was not the only copy. For insurance and employee safety purposes, the Gilded Oaks communication system automatically uploaded its audio logs to an independent server every night. That server contained the complete conversations before, during, and after Caleb poured coke over Imani. Monday's hearing would no longer be only a fight over land. It would become the moment Imani forced the entire city to hear the conspiracy and the voices of the people who had created it. The City Hall chamber was already full when Harlan Pembroke opened the televised hearing. Reporters crowded the rear aisle, cameras faced the council platform, and dozens of displaced families from Open Hands watched from the public gallery. Harlan spoke in the calm, polished tone of a man who believed authority could make accusations sound like fact. He described Open Hands as financially unstable, poorly managed, and unsafe for the surrounding neighborhood. The city attorney then requested immediate seizure of the property, claiming the shelter's collapse had created an urgent public risk. Quentin Shaw appeared as a protected whistleblower and testified that Imani had personally ordered false invoices, removed delivery controls, and redirected charity money into private projects. Sebastian Rourke denied any meaningful relationship with Quentin and insisted the Gilded Oak had merely been dragged into a billionaire family's internal scandal. Caleb offered what sounded like an apology, but was carefully designed to admit nothing. He said he regretted his unprofessional reaction while continuing to claim that Imani had threatened him first. Marianne sat behind him with the same controlled expression she had worn while coke ran down Imani's face. When Imani was finally invited to speak, she did not mention Roman's wealth, the value of his company, or the influence he could bring into the room. Instead, she called 4 witnesses whose names had never appeared in the Gilded Oaks public statements. The first was a homeless veteran whose meal had been dumped into his bag after he was told not to sit near paying customers. The second was a black delivery driver who had been accused of theft when he asked a manager to sign for an order. The third was a mother forced outside because her autistic son had made too much noise. The fourth was an immigrant employee threatened with deportation after reporting wage theft and harassment. Each complaint had been closed by Marianne using the exact same phrase, "not consistent with service standards." The words sounded neutral until they were repeated 4 times, attached to 4 different acts of cruelty. Imani looked toward the council and said, "This was never one employee losing control. It was a system teaching people who deserved dignity and who could be humiliated without consequence." Evelyn Price then introduced the audio files recovered from the restaurant's independent insurance server. The lights dimmed, and Marianne's voice filled the chamber. "Let her reach the center of the room. Kyle will record from the right. Do not pour the drink until she moves toward you." A murmur passed through the audience. Then Quentin's voice followed. "She will not leave without seeing the invoices. Make her the problem." The final recording was unmistakable. Harlan Pembroke said, "After this, the council will have enough justification to seize the facility." The room erupted. Harlan immediately declared that the files had been generated with artificial intelligence. His attorney demanded that the broadcast be stopped and the recordings excluded. Evelyn was ready. She presented matching copies from 3 independent servers, encrypted timestamps, network logs, and access records from Harlan's own phone. The files had existed before the scandal became public. They had not been created, altered, or planted by Roman. Harlan's confidence finally cracked. Sebastian leaned toward his attorney. Marianne stared at the table. Quentin looked from one man to the other and realized they had prepared a defense that left him as the disposable center of the conspiracy. 2 investigators approached to escort Quentin into a separate room for questioning. Before they reached the door, he stopped and turned toward the cameras. "I have another recording," he said. "It is from the meeting where they decided to burn Open Hands. But if I give it to you, someone sitting on that council platform will go to prison." Every camera in the chamber swung toward the officials seated above Imani. The conspiracy had reached the very table responsible for judging her, and the next piece of evidence could prove that the people preparing to take Open Hands were the same people who had been paid to destroy it. Quentin Shaw agreed to cooperate only after prosecutors made it clear that the conspiracy was collapsing around him. He asked for reduced charges protection from the men he had served and a guarantee that he would not be placed in the same facility as Sebastian Rourke's associates. Imani did not object to a lawful agreement, but she insisted that cooperation could not be confused with innocence. Quentin had forged her signature, delivered her private schedule and photographs to Marianne, redirected relief money through shell companies, planted evidence inside her office. Safe issued the access card used by the arsonist and accepted a percentage of the Pembroke River district development. He had not been a frightened employee following orders. He had been one of the architects. Under questioning, Quentin admitted everything and surrendered an audio recording made during a private meeting at an exclusive club. On the recording, Harlan Pembroke, Sebastian Ellison, Meridian's vice chairman, and 2 city council members discussed how to turn Open Hands into what they called a toxic institution in the public mind. One of them complained that financial fraud would be too complicated for the public to follow. Sebastian proposed something simpler. Create an image people would understand instantly. A wealthy black woman, angry, in a luxury restaurant, threatening an ordinary worker. Harlan replied that the public would believe the stereotype before it read a single audit report. That was why Caleb had been instructed to provoke Imani on camera. The coke was not an impulsive act of cruelty. It was the opening scene of a political operation. The moment prosecutors released the authenticated recording, an emergency alert sounded at the city data center. Someone had initiated a coordinated deletion of zoning applications, warehouse permits, financial transfers, and redevelopment communications connected to Pembroke River District. Evelyn Price had expected a final attempt to destroy the trail. Days earlier, she had ordered encrypted copies stored on an independent federal system. Investigators preserved the evidence while tracing the deletion command to an administrator working under one of Harlan's political appointees. Sebastian attempted to leave the city aboard a private aircraft, but federal agents stopped him before takeoff. Harlan claimed that his actions were protected because they had occurred within his official duties. Prosecutors answered by producing records of a secret account that had received payments from Sebastian's development alliance. Marianne tried to place the entire restaurant operation on Caleb, describing him as an unstable employee who acted without authorization. Jade destroyed that defense with archived messages in which Marianne called Caleb perfect for the assignment because he had humiliated poor customers before without attracting successful complaints. Faced with the messages, the camera footage, and the audio logs, Caleb finally admitted that Marianne had promised him a promotion if he made Imani react violently on camera. The legal consequences arrived quickly. Harlan was charged with bribery, public fraud, obstruction, and conspiracy to seize property through corrupt government action. Sebastian faced charges involving contract fraud, money laundering, witness intimidation, and destruction of evidence. Quentin was charged with embezzlement, forgery, evidence, fabrication, and complicity in the arson. Marianne was prosecuted for conspiracy to commit assault, false statements, and witness intimidation. Caleb remained responsible for the attack and his role in staging the footage. The council members who accepted payments were suspended and placed under investigation. Ellison Meridian's vice chairman was arrested for using the company's investment funds to finance the network and position himself to replace Roman. Outside the courthouse, a reporter asked Imani whether Caleb would have treated her differently if he had known she was a billionaire's wife. She answered without hesitation, "That is exactly the problem. He stopped smiling when he learned my husband was wealthy, but my dignity did not appear at the same moment as Roman's bank account." She demanded that the case not end with one employee being fired while the systems that selected, trained, protected, and rewarded him remained untouched. Vendor oversight, employee reporting, city contracts, and charity delivery verification all had to be rebuilt. A newly appointed council voted to cancel the seizure of Open Hands. Then Imani announced a plan no one expected. She wanted the money recovered from the fraud used to purchase the Gilded Oak and transfer ownership to a community trust. The place that had used a cup of Coke to tell her she did not belong would become a place where no one had to prove wealth, status, or influence before being allowed through the door. 8 months later, the building that had once housed the Gilded Oak opened its doors under a new name, the Open Table. The former restaurant chain had been placed under court supervision, so its assets could compensate victims, repay stolen charity funds, and support community recovery. Several locations were sold while the site where Imani Ellison had been humiliated was transferred to a community trust. The polished marble remained, but the old rules were gone. Paying customers and people seeking assistance entered through the same door. There was no separate seating area for the poor, no dress code used as an excuse for exclusion, and no manager permitted to judge a person's worth by clothing or income. Part of every purchase funded emergency meals. Discrimination complaints went directly to an independent review office. Employees who reported misconduct received legal protection, and every charitable delivery could be tracked through a transparent public system. Jade Morales became director of the Whistleblower Protection Program. Malik Carter received a scholarship to study emergency management. Roman returned to Ellison Meridian after a new board vote, but he accepted reduced executive power and permanent independent oversight. The company repaid every dollar of profit connected to the stolen food network, even though Roman had not personally approved the scheme. Imani remained the leader of Open Hands, but financial authority was divided among several independent officers, so no single person could ever control the accounts, signatures, and evidence again. On opening morning, Imani did not arrive in a designer dress or surrounded by reporters. She wore the same old sweater from the day Caleb had poured Coke over her head. It had been washed many times, but a faint brown mark remained near the collar. She entered before the public ceremony, carrying an ordinary canvas bag. A new employee looked up from arranging tables. He did not recognize her. He did not stare at the stain or ask whether she could afford to eat. Instead, he smiled, pulled out a chair and said, "Good morning. Do you need a meal, a place to rest, or someone we can call to help you?" Imani slowly looked around the room. This was where customers had once laughed while Coke ran down her face. This was where phones had risen to record her humiliation and where 2 guards had grabbed her arms. Now no one whispered. No one watched her with suspicion. She asked the employee, "Do you know who I am?" He shook his head. "No, but you walked through our door, so you are our guest." Roman stood across the room without security guards or a crowd of executives. He said nothing. This moment belonged to Imani, and to everyone who had once entered a public place wondering whether they would be treated as human before being asked to prove their value. A little girl who had lived at Open Hands noticed the faded stain on Imani's sweater. "Why did you keep that shirt?" she asked. Imani knelt beside her. "Because that day they only began apologizing after they learned my husband had money. This shirt reminds me that we must build places that know how to respect people before they know whether those people have power." When the doors officially opened, Imani served the first meal to a homeless man waiting quietly near the entrance. He received the same plate, sat at the same kind of table, and was treated with the same care as every paying customer. There were no cameras arranged for publicity, and no oversized check displayed for praise. You do not have to be important to the world to deserve to be treated like a human being. Imani left the open table wearing the old sweater, not as a billionaire's wife, and not as the woman who had defeated a corrupt system. She walked away simply as herself, and for the first time that place had learned to recognize her dignity before her name, her status, or the powerful man standing behind her. Imani's victory was never about proving that the staff had humiliated the wrong woman. It was about exposing a world that only recognizes dignity after wealth walks through the door. The Coke stain faded, but the truth it revealed forced an entire corrupt system to collapse and turned a place of cruelty into a table where everyone could belong. So tell us in the comments, would they have apologized if Roman had never entered that restaurant? If this story moved you, please like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories, where courage exposes injustice and dignity has the final word.